Welcome back to The Deep Dive. You're listening to AI-deas, our channel on the Good Business Podcast. We're proudly hosted by the PHINMA-DLSU Center for Business and Society, and we're all about, promoting business as a force for good. And just a quick reminder for you, our listener, this entire deep dive, it's actually custom-generated, synthesized, using Notebook LM technology.
And today, our mission is pretty intense. We're diving deep into a really profound analysis of modern instability. Our main source is an article called Permanent Impermanence. It comes from the Managing for Society column, published in the Manila Times. And this piece, it really forces us to confront something fundamental, a philosophical idea we often just toss around lightly. Change is constant. It is the most permanent thing in life.
Right. That's our jumping off point. We all sort of nod along when we hear that, don't we? But how many of us really grapple with the overwhelming, destabilizing impact of that constant, relentless change? To really get a handle on this modern anxiety, the source material takes us back, interestingly, to Alvin Toffler's classic 1970 work, Future Shock.
Yeah, and what's so striking is that even though Toffler wrote this decades ago, it feels like a perfect blueprint for the sheer volatility we see today. He pinpointed these three interwoven characteristics of change that create this feeling of constant upheaval: transience, novelty, and diversity.
Interwoven. So they don't just stand alone.
Exactly. They feed off each other. They compound the effect.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because these three, transience, novelty, diversity, they really do feel like the air we're breathing every day, this constant uncertainty. Let's start with transience.
Okay, so transience is basically the insight that everything in modern life, our relationships with people, with things, organizations, even ideas, it's all becoming shorter-lived, faster, much more fragile. The lifespan of these connections is just shrinking. Permanence is, it's becoming a real rarity.
It's easy to just brush that off as, progress or efficiency maybe. But let's be honest, this focus on the short term, especially in business, it must carry a cost, right? I mean, the source mentions things like the decline in organizational loyalty. Is that always a bad thing, though? Couldn't it just mean employees are more agile, more adaptable?
That's a really important point. Agility is definitely necessary, yes. But this constant cycle of attaching and detaching, it introduces friction. There's a psychological cost there. When the whole environment seems to say everything is disposable, from the products we buy to maybe the professional roles we hold, individuals really struggle to build that stable foundation needed for, say, long-term planning or security.
Yeah, I can see that.
We're constantly cycling through ideas, jobs, connections, and that takes energy. The source really stresses that for organizations, this means you have to actively manage potential burnout, not just from overwork, but from this constant psychological need to form and then break ties. That makes a lot of sense. And it links straight into the second characteristic you mentioned, novelty. This is where it gets really interesting for me. The novelty isn't just about new stuff popping up. It's like the whole definition of normal keeps shifting under our feet.
Exactly right. If transience is about the speed of change, novelty is more about the cognitive load it creates, the mental effort involved. When the landscape around you is always unfamiliar, and ambiguity is pretty much the only constant, it puts a huge strain on mental health, on our sense of identity even.
Like the example of a professional feeling like any skill they learn today might be useless tomorrow.
Precisely. That feeling, that continuous need to learn, unlearn, relearn, just to kind of stay afloat. It causes deep stress. So if you're running an organization, you can't just assume your people are adapting on their own anymore. You have to actively prepare them somehow to thrive when things are constantly unfamiliar.
That's the challenge, isn't it? You almost have to train them not just for a specific task, but for dealing with constant destabilization itself.
Wow. So the expectation of stability becomes the most destabilizing thing.
In a way, yes. You have to build this kind of institutional tolerance for the unknown, for ambiguity. Okay, and that brings us to the third piece of the puzzle, diversity. Now, we usually talk about diversity as a good thing, expanding perspectives and all that, but the source points out a paradox here, doesn't it? It does. Toffler called it the surfeit of choices, and overload.
A surfeit of choices.
Yeah, this overwhelming abundance of options, information, different cultural viewpoints, products. It's critical. But instead of feeling empowered by all this variety, we often end up just confused, maybe even paralyzed, and ultimately kind of dissatisfied.
But hang on, how does more choice paralyze us? If I'm exposed to more cultures, more ideas, shouldn't that make me more adaptable, not less?
Conceptually, yes, it should. But the paradox the source highlights is this simultaneous pressure towards standardization.
Oh, okay.
So on one hand, we're flooded with diverse, enriching ideas from everywhere. On the other, market forces, global trends, they push for mass consumption, for uniformity in some ways.
So you get pulled in two directions.
Exactly. It creates this mix of enrichment and this deep disorientation.
Mm.
The problem isn't just the number of choices, maybe, but our inability to pick a reliable or stable path because the goalposts keep moving thanks to transience and novelty.
Right. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, this inability to choose or to trust our framework, which comes from this trio, transience, novelty, diversity, that translates pretty quickly into failures in the systems we depend on.
Precisely. From that internal cognitive overload to potentially external institutional catastrophe, it can happen fast. When we can't cope internally, our external structures, the things we build as a society, they often buckle. And we see this reflected, tragically, in some of the real-world examples mentioned in the source material.
It's a harsh connection to make. The source really underscores the state of permanent impermanence by pointing to some devastating catastrophes the country has faced. We're talking about, powerful earthquakes like the ones in Cebu and Davao. They left victims deeply traumatized, anxious about basic survival food, water, while dealing with constant aftershocks. That's profound instability.
And then you have the flooding issue. Continuous shocking floods in places like Metro Manila and provinces like Bulacan. And the source points out these weren't just natural disasters in isolation. No, it suggests they expose something deeper, highlighting anomalous and substandard anti-flood projects of the government.
So when that external instability hits geological, meteorological, whatever we desperately need stable ethical infrastructure to rely on, and when that fails,
it's evidence of an institutional failure, a failure to adapt to the reality of change, perhaps even an ethical failure.
which brings us to that ethical dimension. You mentioned corruption earlier. The source makes a pretty provocative statement suggesting corruption itself is framed as an opportunity to change. How does that work? That sounds counterintuitive.
Well, it's not endorsing corruption itself, obviously. It's more about framing the exposure of that corruption as the opportunity. Think of corruption as a kind of institutional stagnation, right? A refusal to adapt to basic standards of honesty, of public service, even as the world changes rapidly.
Okay.
So the pressure from this permanent impermanence, this constant change, it forces these ethical failures out into the open. And that demands a response, a stable, positive counterforce.
And we see examples of this demand for a counterforce globally, right? The source mentions Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for struggles moving from dictatorship towards democracy.
Yes, that's cited as an example of the world recognizing and rewarding those who fight for ethical permanence amidst political chaos. It's a powerful symbol. And locally, the scale of this crisis of institutional trust is quite stark. The source mentions the Philippines ranking, 114 out of 180 on the 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index?
That's not great.
No. And when a country is already dealing with calamities, with poverty, that lack of ethical permanence, that widespread corruption, it becomes a really serious threat to public trust. The demand for justice, for integrity, it becomes a kind of anchor in the chaos.
So what actually provides that anchor then? Where does the source suggest people find real stability when everything feels like it's shifting?
It seems to point towards collective action and shared values. The idea that real change comes from a positive force, a culture that can rebuild public trust. It notes the diverse groups often involved in pushing for change, people from academia, religious groups, businesses, different organizations acting together. This unified call for non-negotiable principles, that's what can provide stability when other structures fail us.
Okay, let's zoom back out to Toffler for a moment. You mentioned the source clarifies the difference between culture shock and his term future shock. That seems important.
It's absolutely crucial for understanding the depth of the modern crisis we're discussing. Culture shocks traditionally implies a temporary dislocation. You travel, you encounter a radically different environment, but you sort of expect eventually to return home to what's familiar.
Right.
But future shock. Toffler emphasized irreversible change. The unsettling part isn't just being somewhere unfamiliar. It's the realization that there's no going back to the old normal. The world you knew simply doesn't exist anymore.
Wow. So what does all this mean for us right now? This convergence of transience, novelty, and diversity. It creates what the source calls a crisis of adaptation. And that crisis isn't just logistical or political, it's deeply psychological too. It brings this keen sense of sadness or regret, maybe, for the stability we feel we've lost.
Yeah, and that sense of loss, that regret, it can manifest in some really worrying ways across society. When individuals and institutions just fail to adapt to this irreversible change, well, the source warns about the symptoms: agitation, depression, high turnover in workplaces, but also, tragically, things like extremism, terrorism, and even the rise of authoritarianism as people grasp for any kind of perceived stability, even a harmful one.
So future shock kind of forces change, it demands we adapt. But the cost of not changing certain things, especially core ethical things for the greater good, that becomes the real test, doesn't it? Like when people are in positions of public service, whether that's business or government, the source implies there are non-negotiable principles: honesty, integrity, respect. Those have to be permanent, even if everything else is constantly shifting.
Absolutely. To sort of synthesize this for you, the listener, in a world that feels defined by change, instability, uncertainty, the source really concludes that an individual's faith, their trust, their commitment to core ethical principles, those become the most powerful anchors we have. In this ephemeral existence, we're really called to reflect on what's truly lasting. Where can we place our ultimate hope? Maybe not in systems that constantly change, but in durable values. That's a really profound thought to end on. So, considering this whole analysis of permanent impermanence, we want to leave you with a final question to mull over.
What specific system or maybe relationship in your own life currently costs too much not to change? Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. We really encourage you to continue your own exploration of these ideas, this concept of resilient adaptation in a changing world. And we'll leave you with that powerful final sentiment from the source material: change must happen no matter how much it will cost for the greater benefit of all. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.